Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzy Oswald. Last week's guest, Dr. George Sieg, led us in a fascinating discussion on apocalyptic thinking, apocalyptic themes, and popular culture. We ran out of time before we had a chance to explore his other main academic interests, and that would be esotericism, occultism, and magic, and how that might relate to our understanding of religion and spirituality. So I invited him back this week, and George, thank you for joining us again.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to return. It's good to be back. I enjoyed our last conversation immensely, and the time completely flew by, as it tends to do lately in the strange liminal space and time that we're in. But even more so, the fascinating conversation. So I'm really glad to be back.
Well, for just briefly then, if viewers didn't see last week's program, your graduate work is in esotericism, Western esotericism, and a lot of your research and specialty is in that field. So I wanted to have give you the chance then to kind of focus on that in this week's episode. And it occurs to me that esotericism itself might be a word or a concept that would be unfamiliar to many of our listeners. So maybe we should start with just an explanation of what it is you study. What is esotericism? What is occultism?
So academics have come to differentiate those two concepts. Occultism generally now being regarded as a subcategory of the broader category of esotericism, so that's what I'll start with.
Okay.
And I think it would be most useful, especially given viewers' interest in religion, if I very quickly traced its heritage, and that will say a lot about what its relevance to and relationship to religion might prove to be.
That'd be great, yeah.
So the root is the Greek prefix eso, as in tau eso. You see the prefix used in Platonic dialogues, referring to something inward or to the inward things. Its opposite is exo, and of course we're much more familiar with that prefix casually when we also see it in the front of other things about going out, whether it be exile or an exodus or something like that. So there's a differentiation within the Platonic worldview, apparently, between what is inner and what is outer. You don't see a reference to the construction of the concept of esoterikos until it actually appears in the satire by Lucian of Samosata some centuries later. And the implication of esoterikos would be someone like well-versed in or dedicated to inward things, perhaps in reference to the mysteries, the ancient mystery cults. That could be a crossover with the history of religion.
Right.
We don't see esotericism as a ism until the early 19th century in a sort of a dictionary of a French scholar, Jacques Mater, who was actually, again, writing rather pejoratively about Gnostic worldviews, another crossover with religion. But so far, you go from Plato's rather mystical reference, or philosophical, or mystical philosophical, depending on your interpretation, through uses of satire, uses of pejorative construction, until another French author in the mid-19th century, Alphonse Louis Constant, better known by his self-chosen Hebraization, Eliphas Levi, writing books we would easily recognize and academically categorize as esoteric and occult books, focusing on really what we would see as intersections of magical practice with religious belief. He used the term esotericism in a positive way, and he also used the term occultism in a positive way. He didn't really distinguish them heavily as a practitioner, but this use of the term as a positive term provided a basis for later scholars, most particularly Antoine Favre, who wrote really the foundational book of the academic field, Access to Western Esotericism, to begin to define what exactly is meant by these worldviews. Now, we could survey quite a lot of different academic constructions of them, but I think interested viewers can do that themselves. Better, I would like to just hopefully succinctly express how I would use the term esotericism to define a worldview, and that might help.
Before you do that, before you define, before you use the term to define a worldview, let me ask you this, and I think you implied it. Esotericism as a worldview, can it, I know it's not necessarily connected to a religious worldview, and in some cases it might be antithetical to it, but can esotericism as a worldview also be thought of in a way that supports a religious worldview?
As distinct from actually being identical with it? Yes, absolutely. Yes, and I think that's a great setup, because that will, I think, make it more clear why it's useful to define it by itself, but also how it might relate to more familiar things. So, okay,
good.
So I would say that esotericism describes any systematic worldview that includes beliefs that themselves would support magical practices, which not only have a worldly orientation and would support endeavors to transmute, transform, or otherwise alter something in the world, but also would offer self-transmutation of some type, whether it's described as illumination, enlightenment, liberation, and so forth, for the practitioner. This distinguishes esotericism from magical worldviews in general, such that I would tend to see the magical worldview as the broadest category in which esoteric worldviews and then the subcategory occult worldviews are included. The occultism, again, would be a systematic esoteric worldview which embraces modern ideas of progress, basically modernity, hence the term, historical term, modern occult revival. Perhaps viewers can already conceive of all the combinatorics one could create for worldviews just involving those three concepts, with religion then as a completely distinct category, which nevertheless could overlap with any and or all of them, or perhaps none of them. Although I've had conversations like this in the past, of course, teaching courses on the history of esotericism, magic, and religion, giving lectures and presentations, and it often comes up that people have a difficult time suddenly thinking of a religion that doesn't have any of these features. So to go back to your question, could the worldviews be supportive of religious belief, even if we're not talking about a religion entirely identified with magic, esotericism, and the occult? The answer is an overwhelming yes, to the degree that it is an absolute struggle to find a religious worldview that is bereft of these elements. Usually one has to resort to other academic constructions like political religions to do that. Usually my favorite example would be something like Maoism. It seems to be the absolutely freest religious style belief, if one accepts the academic idea of political religion, freest of any of those other elements. And I suppose, depending on one's preference in worldview, that is either praise condemnation or a very interesting observation, just depending on one's preferences in worldview.
Yeah, so that's really very interesting, because I think most of the time someone who's a very religious or devout person may bristle at the suggestion that somehow magic or occultism or esotericism would somehow undergird a religious worldview. But really, when, as you said, when you think about practices such as prayer or healing within a religious context, then in a sense, I guess, those concepts are undergirded by esoteric worldview. Is that a correct statement?
I would say they're undergirded by magical worldviews.
Magical worldviews, even a stronger
I mean,
statement.
healing is absolutely my favorite example, but I can't credit myself for the use of the example I'm about to give you. There's a long form of this and a very short form, and I can do the very short form because somebody might have noticed I have a prop here. Perhaps I should have had it last week, because I could have, opened the orange seal that containeth the bowl. But anyway, the example originally comes from an academic article by Lionel Snell called Four Glasses of Water. He's more widely known as the pseudonym Ramsay Dukes, one of the sort of, if not grandfathers, perhaps uncles of the chaos magic contemporary esoteric magical and occult movement. So it basically works like this. If you had four liquids all labeled, you could associate them pretty well with different worldviews. So obviously this is pretty clearly a H2O.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you'd have to take my word for it, but if you had a scientific worldview, a purely scientific worldview, of course you wouldn't. You'd need to individually yourself objectively assess it with an instrument, right? Okay. But if it were blessed by, let me just use a very good local example. I come from New Mexico. If this were blessed by a Catholic priest, properly recognized as a Catholic priest, it would be holy water in that worldview, such that someone who didn't believe in Catholicism might not care, but you wouldn't have an academic argument about whether it was properly qualified holy water. It's pretty clear. To me, that really expresses a religious worldview very clearly. You could use it for healing, though. Many people do in folk religion, but you still wouldn't take it back to the priest and say, or more properly, you wouldn't then go to the bishop and say, this water did not cure COVID-19. I don't think that person is really a priest. But if I took here this, let's just pretend that this was a magical orange bowl healing water to avoid any implications of product placement, and marketed as a professional magician that this potion cured a variety of diseases, no one would really expect it to be scientifically measurable unless they were involved in occultism, right, which embraces modernity and ideas of technological progress. But you would expect it, at least from your own perspective, to do something. And so the fact that people very often, maybe even most often, care about the authenticity of religious practices insofar as they support effects of some kind, whether they be subjective personal experiences or miracles of some type, really shows a certain close relationship between those worldviews, but also illustrates their distinction. The original reference I give also proposes that aesthetics actually functions independently as a worldview, which I think is probably a sort of a separate conversation, but it makes an interesting point that those worldviews we've talked about leave out the idea that there could be a collectively recognized subjective experience, which art seems to afford. But that's probably a separate conversation.
Yeah, maybe we'll have a third interview down the road.
That would be fun.
So the idea of the miraculous, or the idea of healing within a religious tradition, is actually based upon or undergirded by this sense of a magical worldview. You can't reference those concepts without somehow accepting this premise of a magical worldview. That's what I got from what you were saying there. I wanted to also reflect on a couple of words that you said. Well, one word.
I would, before you do, want to clarify that I don't mean to suggest that there is something inconsistent in themselves about religious worldviews that assert that human beings could not perform miracles by their own agency, right, or something like this. Only to suggest that functionally, in terms of human experience, there's that close relationship. I realize that there are plenty of theologies in which only God could suspend apparent natural law, or even things like occasionalism, in which there is no natural law, only the will of God. But in terms of human subjective experience, there's a certain overlap, which examples like this support when you start talking about specific examples, such as whether holy water heals people and whether or not healing potions heal people. Because if healing potions don't heal people in a magical worldview, generally the person presenting them would be regarded as a fraud because it didn't work. Yeah.
So do your comments suggest also that so if you have a magical worldview that can either be undergirding a religious worldview or in some ways antithetical to it, is a magical worldview also antithetical to something you might call a scientific worldview?
Going with the same example, because it really is my favorite way of comparing the worldviews, it would be important not to conflate scientific worldview with a materialist worldview. Many magical practitioners, particularly occultists, say they embrace a sort of scientific or experimental model. And certainly many of the aforementioned practitioners have believed in a religious worldview that isn't directly associated with their esoteric, magical, or occult practice throughout the centuries. But purely of itself, though, I would still say that the premises of scientific practice as a practice requiring experimentation and hypothesis falsification are very different from the core premise of a magical worldview, which is very different from the core premise of a religious worldview. And if I had to describe then the core premise of a magical worldview, the premise would be that intention has power. Mm-hmm. And the core premise of a religious worldview perhaps has been the subject of much more academic debate, but I feel like I would have to take a stab at it. But I would still rather credit a good source, and I hold that Rudolf Otto was right, and that religion is irreducible, and that it depends on numinous experience as a source of not just numinous experience for itself, but numinous, so maybe this is what I'm sort of adding to Otto's frame, numinous experience as the source of authority with regard to whatever reality it's being applied to, which really accounts for many variations of religion and how it's expressed, but that the numinous experience, whatever it may be, is the central source of authority, whereas someone with a purely magical worldview does not care what experience they have and what its source is, other than its effect, such that there is seemingly a circular causal logic that, magic is caused by magic. And perhaps then that's where the crossover is. It reminds one of mysticisms of consciousness that is self-consciously conscious, but also useless unless applied in a
mysticism of consciousness is what came to mind earlier when you were talking about transmutation.
I'm glad that came to mind. I wasn't sure how clear that my presentation was, so I'm glad to.
But you mentioned transmutation. So the first time,
and I think that's what makes a magical worldview esoteric, by the way, is when there's a systematic approach to that.
Okay. So is magic then? I mean, is it more than simply manipulation of materials? I mean, it's more than just alchemy. Is that, or am I
Uh,
oversimplifying alchemy?
no, alchemy definitely isn't only materials. That would be the chemistry part, which really emerged and developed from that process of alchemy. Alchemy is, in the study of Western esotericism, usually the prototypical example, actually, of an esoteric worldview that's highly systematic, that includes uh, the medieval equivalent of occult practice, which involves, and of course later Renaissance occult practice, which involved transmutation of natural elements based on their virtues with transformation of the practitioner. I also don't want to suggest that purely magical worldviews wouldn't involve self-directed elements. They certainly would, but there wouldn't necessarily be in those worldviews some kind of construction of a preferred continuous or discontinuous improvement or transmutation of consciousness as much as simply the ability to transform, right?
Right.
So in a purely magical worldview, whatever would be thought of as illumination or enlightenment would be exactly the same as getting much better at magic.
Okay.
Which is, interestingly, we certainly see this in some indigenous worldviews that have no, where even animism seems to be an elaboration, animism in the sense of belief in souls, is an elaboration that's not there, right? So a worldview based entirely on mana and the skill of using it, sometimes when presented this way, sounds like, oh, this surely must be a contemporary popular culture scholar, lifting something from, the world of gaming and supposing it must exist in reality, just like contemporary so-called chaos magicians might do in engineering what they would see as a purely magical worldview. But in fact, if you look at those particular indigenous groups, particularly certain Polynesian tribes, you really see something like this. There is just not that element of preference for certain states of consciousness as valuable in themselves. Things are evaluated based on what they do. And I think that's very characteristic of magic, but not necessarily characteristic of esotericism, which tends to present a worldview with an orientation towards something, some kind of transmutation, whether it's metaphorically led into gold that might involve actual gold, but also the gold of the spirit, or whether it involves some kind of developed wisdom, or in the sense of modern occultism, involves some kind of progress, whether that might be worldly progress, social progress. Quite a lot of occultists have been involved in modern politics as well. That's a whole other interesting subject, which my doctoral research engaged with and which I've written about to some extent.
So the transformation, it doesn't have to be materialistic. It can be a transmutation of the self.
Very much so.
Transmutation of the spirit, which I think is fascinating. And the thing that kind of, as I listen to you speak, it really sort of drives home the point to me that even in the contemporary world, we did not give up, we haven't given up on magical worldviews, right? The Enlightenment didn't drive magic away. It didn't drive religion away. So we still have not only a rationalistic scientific worldview operating in contemporary society and culture, but also various levels of magical worldviews, religious worldviews.
I think the academic world has become rightfully disenchanted with the thesis of disenchantment. But yes, you were about to say also we see esoteric worldviews, plenty of them in contemporary life. Yeah, all of these worldviews seem available at present. It's difficult to think of a worldview that we can think of and know of that someone in some form does not continue to hold. I mean, there may be specific dead religions, dead magical paradigms, but magicians love that kind of thing and certainly will try to, if they can't excavate it, they'll just recreate it, right? It seems as though if you can think of believing it, someone may think of believing it, even to the point of spawning, of fiction spawning real life, not just magical practices, although that's certainly a common thing in contemporary esotericism, but certainly even fiction-based religions, not just parody religions, which are popular now, but seemingly sincere religious beliefs, if not practices. Obviously, many viewers may be familiar with the religious census incident involving Jediism.
Right.
And that surely may be some sort of like a demographic stunt, although it would have to be a well-coordinated one to be in any way deliberate. But ultimately, that did seem to lead to small groups, perhaps operating online, but groups of people attempting to put together some practice that would emulate what they might imagine, that kind of worldview to be like. And that's just a sort of a very casual example. Within the world of esotericism, magic, and occultism, there are dedicated, serious practitioners who are using fictional inspired content more than for its aesthetic value, but also as a way of tapping into popular culture, into the zeitgeist, or trying to find aesthetic representations that better fit their expectations for mythology and cosmology in a world that seems superficially disenchanted, but in fact, in which the content of these worldviews is more accessible than it has ever been. The ability to live in them, though, may be considerably mediated, right, in the sense that, well, obviously our conversation here is mediated in multiple ways, but that also affords opportunities for these worldviews to flourish in new and interesting combinations.
Well, George, as always, our 30-minute format seems to just get us started on a conversation, and unfortunately we're out of time again, but I have found this to be fascinating, and I appreciate you being willing to come back for us, and maybe there will be more in the future.
Well, I really, again, really appreciate the opportunity, and I want to thank you for inviting me back and bringing our conversation into some new and interesting places. Certainly, it's given me inspiration for some future research and perhaps some future writing. But it very much would be a pleasure to see you here again, as well as, of course, again in person. We had met at the Popular Culture Conference in the Southwest, and I hope I'll see you there again sometime as I continue to have a lot of panels on esotericism, magic, and occultism.
Absolutely. There. Maybe we can fly you across country and get you in our studio next time.
That would be amazing. I would love to see your studio in person. Obviously, I've seen your other interviews in the studio, and it really does look like a wonderful environment to continue a conversation.
All right. Well, thank you, George, and thank you, all you viewers. That's it for Religion and Life for this week and for this season. I hope you will join us in the fall as we begin season number 12, and only hope we can be back in the studios at App TV by then. But until then, this is Ozzy Ostwald.